record. Welcome to Jefferson Liberty Radio, the voice of the state of Jefferson in the Central Valley. I am Matthew. I'm joined by Aaron and Alan today. How are you two today?
Great, Matthew. How you doing?
So far, so good.
We have a special guest, but before we get to that, Aaron, tell us about our next meeting.
Okay, our next meeting coming up is going to be September the 19th, and our speaker is going to be Assemblyman Heath Flora of the 12th District. He'll be speaking at 6 p.m. That night also, we're going to have an SOJ quiz and an update at 5:30.
Great, thank you, Aaron. Alan, take it away.
Well, this is a real special podcast, folks. We're going to talk about the water grab. Now, that might sound rather misleading, but in fact, it's actually going to happen. I have here as our guest today Mr. Jake Wenger. Jake is well-versed on water issues. He's a fourth-generation almond farmer who farms just west of Modesto. His father is the past president of the California Farm Bureau, and he is a former MID Board of Directors member. MID, folks, that's Modesto Irrigation District. We're really happy to have you here, Jake.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me, Alan.
It's our pleasure. Well, let's get into this water grab issue. Jake, could you give us your take on the water issues facing the Stanislaus County?
Hi, what's a 3-hour podcast, right?
Yes,
So okay,
exactly.
No, the big thing that people need to know, at least in Stanislaus County and really in the northern Central Valley right now, is that the water threats to the northern Central Valley are greater than anything that anyone has seen since the northern Central Valley was settled. The way that I like to put it is one of the biggest boons for the Central Valley was the development of our water infrastructure. It was the development of the dams and the canal systems. And as big as that was for us economically and as a community, this is the absolute adverse. It will be absolutely devastating to the Central Valley. So when it comes to northern Central Valley water issues, Stanislaus County, where we're at right now, it is a water war. No other way to put it.
So, Jake, I was wondering if you can explain to us in a nutshell what each of the phases of the Bay Delta Plan means.
Sure. So the water grab that Alan mentioned is something that's being done by the State Water Resources Control Board through the Bay Delta Plan. And the Bay Delta Plan has 4 phases. Phase 1 deals with water requirements on the San Joaquin River. There's 2 main sources of water into the Delta, and so part of the Bay Delta Plan is making sure the Delta has a thriving environment. There's what is supposed to be the stated goals. 80% of the water into the Delta comes out of the Sacramento, 15% out of the San Joaquin, and about 5% from other east side rivers. So phase 1, they said, we're going to go after the San Joaquin River and establish flow requirements and environmental requirements on the San Joaquin. Phase 2 deals with the Sacramento River. Phase 3 is a water rights proceeding to change water rights law in California to match up with the requirements they are going to regulate in Phase 1 and 2. And Phase 4 is essentially a cleanup. After they set their environmental goals through Phase 1 and 2, if they didn't meet their standards, then Phase 4 they get to come back and have a second bite at the apple.
Well, thank you, Jake. Concerning water rights, in California, how do water rights differ from that of other parts of the country?
Well, so even in California, water rights vary. So essentially, if you have access to water in California, it's surface water or it's groundwater. You're either getting it out of a reservoir from rain and snow or you're pumping it out of the ground. Now, if you own land in California, you have a right to pump groundwater. So as far as a water right is concerned, if you're a landowner, you have a right to put a straw on the ground and pull out what you want. There is no limit as to what you can pull out right now, which is definitely unique to California. When you get into the Midwest, another, Ogallala Aquifer, they have, adjudicated water basins where they dictate how much people can pull out of the ground. We do not have that yet in California, but we're definitely moving that direction with the 2014 implementation of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which is trying to get groundwater in balance. So then you have surface water as your other source, and surface water are where water rights start coming in. And California water rights law basically says first in time, first in right. So if you were the first one to claim a right to use water on a source, whether that was a river or put in a reservoir or something to that effect, you now have the right. Anyone else that comes in after you can claim a right, but they would become a junior water right holder to that individual. So in the turn of the century, you had all these entities, groups, organizations that were claiming water rights on sources. The state realized that they didn't really have a way to regulate this. So that led to the implementation of what is now the State Water Resources Control Board. So they were created to manage water rights law in California. That happened in 1914. So when you talk about water rights, if you have a senior water right, that is considered pre-1914, before the formation of what is now State Water Board. If you have a junior water right, that is considered post-1914.
Well, you were talking about, or we've been talking about the water grab. Could you define what the water grab really is, particularly here in Stanislaus County, but as it might affect other counties in Jefferson?
Sure. So with Phase 1, there's 3 counties that are primarily impacted. That's San Joaquin, Stanislaus, and Merced, because the 3 tributaries that the State Water Board is going after is the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers. And which, by the way, if Phase 1 is dealing with the San Joaquin extends clear to Friant, but they've targeted just the 3 tributaries on the northern end. Now, my argument as for why that is because those are also the most senior water right holders. The very first irrigation district formed in the state of California was the Turlock Irrigation District. The second irrigation district in the state was the Modesto Irrigation District. So you have the 2 oldest irrigation districts with some of the oldest water rights in California on the Tuolumne River. And you asked about Stanislaus, and we'll keep it a little more Stanislaus County specific. So Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts work as kind of sister districts on the Tuolumne River and also own their own reservoir in Don Pedro. Now, Don Pedro Reservoir was built by the ratepayers within Turlock and Modesto irrigation districts, but also 52% of it was paid for by city and county of San Francisco. They don't own any water in the dam. The reason they paid for 52% was because they wanted to build their own reservoirs upstream. They're a junior water right holder to the irrigation districts, San Francisco is. So for a junior water right holder to build storage upstream, you'd essentially be taking water from a senior right holder before it got to them. After a lot of negotiation, San Francisco said, why don't we help you guys build a much bigger reservoir than old Don Pedro? And they built new Don Pedro in the 70s, and we have a water source that exists today. So we have our water source paid for by our ratepayers. Don Pedro Reservoir is the 6th largest reservoir in California. It is the largest reservoir in California built without state or federal funds. So when you talk about a water grab, and why is it a water grab? Because we're dealing with the oldest irrigation districts, with some of the oldest water rights, who own their water infrastructure, including the reservoir. So I don't know about you guys, but if you decide you're going to take a resource that wasn't paid for by you, nor does it belong to you, I don't know how you describe that other than theft.
That's a perfect term. You mentioned about the quality of, or the reason for this water grab is to maintain the quality of the Bay Delta water quality. But we've been told that this is all about salmon. How How does that work?
So the first rendition 2 years ago, when they released the substitute environmental document, which is the tool that the State Water Board will use to implement the regulations through the Bay Delta Plan, when it came out, they said the stated purpose for this water was for the protection of fall-run San Joaquin Chinook salmon, which are a protected species. They're not endangered; they're a protected species. They had enough documentation that if you stood the SED on the table, it stood 15 inches high. In all of that paperwork, they had one chart that showed that by their estimates, with their regulation, they would bring back 1,103 new fish total on the Stanislaus, Tuolumne, and Merced rivers combined. In this new SED that was just released here a month and a half or so ago, they have actually stricken that chart and have just said, well, we think it will bring back thousands of new fish without any exact idea or number. And they have also now said, and it's for water quality in the Delta to prevent salinity. That's where this argument starts getting into the Twin Tunnels, which the State Water Board will say, it has nothing to do with the Twin Tunnels, which, by the way, the governor now calls the water fix. So for those not familiar, quick rundown of the tunnels. The mouths of the pumps that send water to Southern California are at the south end of the Delta. The Sacramento, which provides most of that water, comes in from the north, which means you have a lot of water that flows through the Delta and out. And it's not a very efficient way to get that water from the Sacramento to the pumps. So they want to bury two large tunnels under the Delta to more efficiently get water from the Sacramento to the mouth of the pumps. However, as I said earlier, the Sacramento River provides 80% of the water supply in the Delta. And if you take a large portion of that and pump it in tunnels under the Delta, you don't have the constant force of fresh water to keep the salt water from the ocean at bay. So you get saltwater intrusion inland, which will destroy habitat and environmental life in the Delta. It'll destroy the islands and a lot of the farming that goes on there. So the water fix is broken. It has a big problem in that it needs water. And when you look at what the State Water Board is requiring from the San Joaquin through Phase 1, although they say it's for fish or water quality, I did find it interesting, as I said in their new update, they said it's for Delta salinity objectives, which to me is them showing their card saying, we need the water to keep the salt water out, because the amount of water they will get is nearly the exact amount of water that the state needs to make the water fix work.
That's really interesting. That kind of harkens me back to the late 70s when they were talking about the peripheral canal, which I think died of a horrible death because of that salinity issue. Am I not correct?
No, very much. And so this is now a regulatory body who has decided that they actually have the authority to demand that other people put the water down. And by the way, I'll touch on one more thing here briefly when I was talking earlier about theft. So the demand is that 40% of the water that rains and snows gets sent out to the ocean. Currently, we operate the river at about 18%, meaning we're capturing 83, 82% of the water that's coming down, and the rest goes out the river. The state would like us to capture 60% and put 40 down the river. But they also understand that that's a recipe for disaster, because the demands on the reservoir for use by agriculture and municipalities combined with going out, you're going to drain the reservoir more years than you're not. There isn't enough water available to meet those requirements. So, Don Pedro Reservoir, 2 million acre-foot capacity for storage. The top 300,000 acre-feet stays open for flood control. The bottom 300,000 acre-feet is a cold pool. So we've got 1.4 million in the middle for storage for the districts. The State Water Board, as part of the Bay Delta Plan and the SED, said that cold pool at 300,000 acre-feet, you have to raise that to 800,000. So they're claiming 500,000 acre-feet of storage in the reservoir as theirs to be able to use for environmental flows.
Wow, that's staggering. And this is going to also occur perhaps in the northern counties of California.
Yeah, so phase 2 of the Bay Delta plan is instituting these similar requirements on the Sacramento. Although while we are looking at a 40% unimpaired flow, the Sacramento region is looking at a 60% unimpaired flow. So the demand on the Sacramento will be even greater as far as the amount of water that will be flushed out to the ocean, in my personal opinion, to satisfy an ideology versus actually going to any benefit whatsoever.
That's really interesting. And that reminds me that all this water that's going to go out into the Delta just to satisfy water needs down in Southern California. I can remember back in the late 2015 when the Water Resource Control Board held meetings up and down Stanislaus, Merced, and San Joaquin counties, and I heard that there were something like 2,000 testimonies.
Far more.
They're proclaiming that was really a serious harm to this region.
There was about 1,200 attendees alone just at the Modesto hearing. There was about 8. I was the only irrigation board member in the area that went to all 5 of the hearings that were there. There was 2 in Sacramento, 1 in Stockton, 1 in Merced, and 1 in Modesto. And they heard from a lot of people saying that this isn't smart.
Well, with all of that testimony against such a water grab, how can the State Water Resource Control Board actually proclaim that they need to take this water anyway? Is it a case of delta salinity over the needs of agriculture and human life?
Well, I think it's a culmination of a lot of things, is really what I think it is. And I actually was on a panel where we had a panel discussion a couple of years ago where it was myself, an environmentalist from San Francisco, and Tom Howard, who is the retiring executive director of the State Water Board. And in his opening statement in this water discussion on this issue, he said that his view and vision for a utopian California was that the state environmental organizations would buy up all the farms in the Central Valley and return the land to its natural state and return the water back to the rivers. And when he sat down, I got my turn to speak, and I said, your dystopian vision for a California you can have because you're going to be retiring in a few months with a pension paid for by all of us as taxpayers. Meanwhile, you don't have to worry about the people whose livelihood depends on those farms, like myself, the people I employ, the people whose parents my kids go to school with, and all these communities that are dependent upon it. You don't have to worry about it because my tax dollars paying for your pension, and you can worry about your vision of what's ideal versus actually having to work and understand how to make a living. And so when you have people like that were in charge of the State Water Board, who do you think he's going to hire as his staff? And then when you get a governor who has certain views and ideologies like water fix or twin tunnels, and then they get to appoint the 5 board members who actually vote on things. You have a staff who's been hired that all has a viewpoint, giving information to a 5-member board of directors that really you only need 3 to implement these regulations. We talk about it as 5 people who can make this determination. It's not 5, it's 3. 3 of the 5 can make the determination. And the State Water Board has pretty far-reaching powers. They are given authority over water rights in California. Now, they have to be able to back them up. And that's where we think we have a great case against them, is they don't have any science to back it up. The science that they're trying to use to justify this water grab, they're taking studies from the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia and other places. Meanwhile, the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts, just in the last 8 years, have spent $25 million on site-specific studies on the Tuolumne River that have been peer-reviewed, meaning given to other scientists who didn't conduct the study, who verified the results and said this is good, and published in scientific journals. So we have a scientific record supporting our opinions. Let me rephrase that. We have a scientific record supporting the facts they have stuff that they're trying to find to support their opinion. And facts trump opinions every time.
And so just to be clear, the Water Resources Board is an appointed board, right? Non-elected.
Correct. They are all appointed. They are appointed to terms, and then those terms are, I think the appointments are ratified by the California State Senate. But they're all 4-year terms, but they're all appointed by the sitting governor at the time. And that isn't people apply, but you know how those sort of appointments go.
Mm-hmm. The deck is stacked.
Yeah.
Well, with the California Water Resource Control Board exposed, if you will, I was going to ask you if it was a good or a bad group, but obviously it's a very political group.
Well, I will say the State Water Resources Control Board doesn't have to be a bad group. It does serve a purpose. And I'm as anti-regulation as the next guy, but I also have to acknowledge that people do need to be we can't have anarchy. You do have to have rules and people who make sure you abide by the rules. So in that spirit, there is a need for something like a state water board. The problem is when you start assessing that they are given too much authority and too much power. Namely, the state water board implements a regulation. Those 5 members, 3 of them vote to say we want to implement a regulation. It gets implemented. You decide it's unfair and you wish to appeal. Who do you think the appeal board is? The same 5 people who voted for the regulation. Do you think they're going to overturn their own opinion? No. That is a broken system. And actually, Adam Gray had legislation to take the appeal power away from the state water board. It made it to the governor's desk, if I'm not mistaken, and failed. Did not get signed there. But his point was they can't be judge, jury, and executioner. If they want to implement the regulation, if there's an appeal, it should go to someone else. And the arguments against was, well, we don't need to go to somebody else because there's hardly ever an appeal that goes through. They're doing it. Well, of course there's hardly ever an appeal that's supported because they're not going to contradict themselves. So is there a need for something like a state water board? Sure. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. Did corrupt people with an agenda get in charge and find out that they're given way more power than they should have? Absolutely.
Well, that's very amazing. We as citizens of Stanislaus County are greatly impacted by this. In your opinion, is there anything that we could do as citizens to prevent this water grab?
Well, they already had the hearings. November 7th is now supposed to be the date that the State Water Board is going to vote to actually implement this legislation. We had a water rally at the Capitol where we had over 1,000 people show up. The hearings were the next 2 days following the rally. And one of the State Water Board members, after the end of those hearings, said, and this was Steve Moore, who's one of the State Water Board members, that I don't know why we changed the date to implement, because I would vote to implement today. And Tam Dodek said she would have seconded it. So despite all of the appeals and all of the information, they still said, no, we intend to move forward. Because we have an agenda, if you ask me, in my opinion. So November 7th, they're going to vote to implement. My guess is there'll still be an opportunity for public comment at that hearing, which will be in Sacramento. They meet at the Cal EPA headquarters. Other than that, we need to spread the word and stay involved because we have to keep shouting. And the second they vote to implement on November 7th, on November 8th, there will be, I would say, at least 200 lawsuits that will be filed. On both sides, by the way, because you have a lot of environmental groups that say 40% unimpaired flow is not enough. You should take more of their water. So there will be hundreds of lawsuits. It will take years just to get those lawsuits whittled down and combine them together and the things that they do in the courtrooms. So we do need to stay abreast of what's going on and stay involved because this issue is not going away for years. So the best ways to do that is to find resources to provide you that information of when and where you can be of use. So first and foremost, I'd like to point people to the Worth Your Fight campaign. Worth Your Fight on Facebook or worthyourfight.org. That is a campaign that was developed by the Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts. On the Stanislaus, they have the Save the Stand campaign. Additionally, one of the things I like to remind people is the irrigation districts developed their own plans to meet the requirements that the State Water Board said they were trying to as far as fish and water quality and everything else. Using the $25 million in studies, Modesto and Turlock irrigation districts created the Tuolumne River Management Plan. You can find out more at tuolumnerivermanagementplan.com or look up Tuolumne River Management Plan on Facebook. That plan is over $150 million in river improvements, environmental habitat, restoration, spawning grounds, a hatchery, and depredation, getting rid of some of the predators that are on the river, water hyacinth removal, in order to restore the river environment and habitat. And so it's not like the districts, and by the way, it includes more water. It includes more water than is put down today. So the irrigation districts have said, we will give you more water, and we will pay for over $150 million in environmental improvements. So when they say it's about fish and not about water, I say baloney, because our communities have ponied up and said, if it's about fish, we'll bring the fish back and we'll finance it. But it's not enough water for them because it's not about fish. It's about water.
About water. Yep. I couldn't agree more. Is MID and TID going to file lawsuits against?
There'll be several. So MID and TID will probably file jointly. There'll probably be lawsuits that will be filed independently by the districts. Our local irrigation districts belong to something called the San Joaquin Tributaries Authority. That is the Modesto and Turlock districts, Oakdale and South San Joaquin irrigation districts, and City and County of San Francisco. They will file suit as a unit. So I would expect a lot of these irrigation districts as individuals, as partners on rivers, as JPAs, joint power authorities, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits that will be filed. And as far as MID, we've had a litigation attorney on retainer for almost 2 years now, just to keep him up to speed on what's going on so he's ready. And he's cracking his knuckles because he said, I can't wait to go to war with these guys in a courtroom. And you know, he does litigation on environmental issues with big dogs. It's what he does. And he said, you know, I've had a lot of cases that, you know, you've got a hard road to hoe. And he said, this one I'm excited for because we have such a scientific record. I feel great about our chances. So, there'll be a lot of lawsuits. In fact, one of the last things I did before I was off the MID board, we put $1 million in an account to be annually used for litigation. Just from one irrigation district. It's just a message to the State Water Board marked as litigation for Bay Delta Plan. So it's put up or shut up. And for our communities, would you rather lose the water and everything that goes along with it? Or would you rather spend the money and you know what? No rate increases or anything to pay for it because the district has planned and saved and has a large sum of money in savings just for the purpose of fighting this issue.
Well, that's a very ambitious plan. But, you know, we haven't heard much from the city of San Francisco, who's severely impacted by this. I don't understand their lack of comment.
So I can explain it a little bit, which is they are really between a rock and a hard place, which is when we have our MID board meetings, we get a lot of people that come in and say, you got to fight this. When San Francisco's Public Utilities Commission has their board meetings. They get a bunch of environmentalists that say, why are you fighting this? We need to give up the water. They know, the PUC does, that it would be detrimental and they cannot endorse it. But the public pressure for them, too, is pretty great. So I can't blame them for not wanting to be out front because their board meetings would be filled with environmentalists who would say, we can't, you guys have to change your stance and you need to support the water grab. So I can't blame them, but San Francisco has been a great partner. They are an ally on this issue, which on a lot of issues you can't necessarily say, but I've been in a lot of meetings with a lot of San Francisco guys, and they are ready to go to war right alongside us. But they will end up being more of a behind-the-scenes type person because publicly, it makes sense when you and I and all of us in this room, we get up and shout and say, you can't do this, because we're right in the impacted area. And when they do it, the people in their constituency and communities around them are coming from a little different, maybe ideology and a little different tax bracket.
Yeah, I can understand the tax bracket thing. But it surprises me that San Francisco hasn't made their citizens aware of this potential loss of their water.
They've tried a little. There was a recent article that came out in the Chronicle that was really, it did a fair enough job trying to explain the threat. So a lot of people don't realize San Francisco as a city has one of the lowest water usages per capita in the state of California. In fact, I think they're the lowest. They tend to be around 40 to 50 gallons of water per person per day. City Modesto is more in the neighborhood of probably 180. It's a significant difference. And why? They don't have lawns. They don't have swimming pools. They don't have the landscaping. Now, they don't also have a lot of the water recycling that we do have in the valley. They tend to use water one time and it goes out to the ocean. So there's not as much gray water use. But as far as their water consumption per capita, very low. So for them to take a hit and try and reduce that even more, it's very difficult. Very difficult to get below, where they're already at around 40 gallons of water per person per day. That's a tough pill to swallow, and I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want my family to have to get cut back to maybe 20 or 30 gallons of water per. It sounds like a lot, not as much as you think.
Yeah, well, but doesn't water from that Crystal Springs Reservoir also feed parts of the lower peninsula below San Francisco?
Yeah, they've got a few different sources, and I think there's when you start getting into some of the cities on the bordering the Delta, you've got some water rights users there that have contracts. So there's a lot of different sources in some of those different parts of the peninsula. But Hetch Hetchy is supplying, I think, to 2 million users, the Hetch Hetchy system, which is on the Tuolumne River.
Well, those 2 million people are San Francisco and then some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The Hetch Hetchy contracts out with some of the other cities around Bay Area.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. How familiar are you with the State of Jefferson movement?
Well, more than some and not as much as others. So that's maybe the best way to put it. I've been in a position over the last few years to go to a lot of community meetings, meet people like yourself, Alan, and other people who have been heavily involved in the local State of Jefferson movement. And so it's not been one that I have actively engaged in because I've been on a water board and a water fight. And so, you pick your battles, and that's been the one that I've been more adept and more able to fight. I've signed the petition on State of Jefferson. I think I've actually probably signed it multiple times. I see, go to these meetings and they go, "Have you signed it?" And I go, "Well, I'm sure I have, but I'll do it again." And so, like I say, it's one that I am more familiar than some and not as familiar as others.
Well, in your opinion, from what you know about the State of Jefferson, do you think the creation of a new state of Jefferson, would actually help in this water issue, since the State of Jefferson will actually be the conveyor of most of the water to the rest of California?
Not necessarily. So the problem is, and that's where I say it might or might not. But when you already have a lot of existing contracts, to change those contracts is a violation of agreements. So you would just have lawsuits between states saying, well, there was already a contract that was in existence between these two purveyors, regardless of now in a state. Now this, a new state could say we're going to implement a tariff or something else that was on it, but it's not going to come without issues. Additionally, we're not including. I don't think. You're not including San Francisco, right? In fact, I don't even think, is San Joaquin County in State of Jefferson? I don't know.
No, there's there is a movement in San Joaquin
But as of now,
County.
they're not in.
They're not in. That's correct.
So that's what I thought, which doesn't necessarily change things because where's the delta in San Joaquin County? So now you would essentially have a state water board that existed in California and water resources that existed in the state of Jefferson, and you'd have a regulatory body in California that would say, we're having a problem with our environmental ecosystem in the Delta, and it's the fault of your users in the state of Jefferson. So it doesn't necessarily mean the issues go away. It just might mean they're fought differently. Now, whether that provides an advantage or not, I wouldn't have a powerful enough crystal ball to be able to find that out. So would it help on this particular issue? I don't think so. Because of when you look at San Joaquin County not being in state of Jefferson and the Delta falling there, and this is the Bay Delta Plan, you just have the same battle, but it would just, instead of being implemented in one state, it would be crossing state lines.
Well, the Bay Delta is a federal program, is it?
No, the Bay Delta Plan that is being implemented, the State Water Resources Control Board, has no impact from feds. Now, they do have federal standards that they have to make sure and implement. But like a lot of environmental issues, any state can implement more stringent environmental regulation than the federal government can. Why does California have a Cal EPA? Right? We have things that are listed as endangered species, or things that are listed as more protected. Everyone knows California is a more regulated state, especially when it comes to a lot of environmental requirements. Well, why is that? Because states are allowed to implement stricter regulations. So State Water Board does have to make sure you're meeting some federal requirements, but they can also implement their own standards because water belongs to the states. So when we talk about water rights law, in water rights law, water belongs to the state of California and the people of California. That's why it's called a water right. You don't own the water. You are given a right to use it. The water still belongs to the state of California. And the State Water Board is tasked with implementing and managing that water.
But under the state of Jefferson, wouldn't the state of Jefferson own the water that's in the state of Jefferson?
Again, you'd have massive lawsuits to dictate who and what and where. I don't know the answer to that question because it would be a massively litigious undertaking to determine what goes with who and who goes with what.
Now, you mentioned contracts. Are these contracts that districts have with whom?
Well, you have contracts with state and federal that are moving water from the east side of the valley into the valley or out to the ocean. You've got all around the state. You've got California water purveyors purchasing water from Northern California. You've got the federal government and the state of California. There's two main aqueducts in California delivering water from northern part of the state to Southern California, the Delta-Mendota Canal and the California Aqueduct. One's owned and operated by the state of California. One's owned and operated by the federal government. You'd now have a new state that would divide those in half. So you already have a delivery system and a water infrastructure system paid for by the state of California, taking water from the northern part of the state to the south. So if you create a state of Jefferson, are you splitting the water infrastructure system in half?
Well, the entire infrastructure that is within the state of Jefferson will become the property of the state of Jefferson. Kamala Harris actually made that comment.
Right. But my point is, it goes through. Right. It's not like it's two separate pieces of infrastructure, one in one part of the, in one that would be in Jefferson and one that would be in California. It's a continuous system that and so it'd be a lot of litigation. And I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying I am not well enough equipped in how that would have to play out to be able to give an accurate answer as far as what would happen. But on this issue with Bay Delta Plan being that San Joaquin County is not in, and the Bay Delta is in San Joaquin County, and you'd have the State Water Board would stay in the state of California, and they're trying to implement this plan, you're having the same fight, you're just having the fight across state lines. As far as the other water issues in the state, like anything that's going to happen with State of Jefferson, there's going to be litigation. I mean, that's just a given. We already know that if it ever were to come to fruition, as many lawsuits as you think you're going to have over whatever on water, you're going to have as many or more on trying to split a state. It's just something you have to be prepared for and know you got to fight and know that you have, like on the water issue, know that you have law on your side to back it up so that you can accomplish your task at hand. But it doesn't mean there's not going to be fights. The outcome of those fights, maybe it depends right now since we're having discussions on getting Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. So maybe a lot of that is being answered right now on how some of those things would turn out down the road. But,
for sure. That would be absolutely critical to this whole issue. In fact, possibly even the creation of the state of Jefferson might depend on Kavanaugh's
fair point
appointment. Well, I know you've served on the MID board of directors. Do you have any plans to run for public office again down the road?
Well, I lost my reelection bid this last November, and so I said, well, my thing in the time right now is I have no immediate plans, but I'm not ruling anything out. So it's a cop-out answer to say I'm not actively pursuing any particular office. I've got 3 young kids at home. I enjoy farming on the family farm, so it's a nice break to be able to farm a little bit and spend time with the family. I've never been one that's thought it'd be a good thing to be involved in especially state politics with a young family at home. It just doesn't seem to work out very well too much. So my go-to answer is I'm always looking for potential and opportunities and keeping my eyes open, but I don't have any commitments to run for anything at this time.
Well, you're certainly very well spoken. I would certainly cast my vote for you in a public election. Do you have anything that you'd like to ask, Aaron?
Well, I know we're kind of off the subject, but I was wondering how Sigma might factor into this Bay Delta plan.
Great question. So Sigma is, of course, setting up groundwater guidelines. So Sigma basically said, we have all these groundwater subbasins around California. Now, we as a state will come in and dictate who gets to use groundwater and who doesn't, but we don't want to. So all these communities that have these groundwater subbasins, you need to form a groundwater sustainability agency that's going to oversee your local groundwater. And then that agency needs to develop a groundwater sustainability plan to show how your groundwater basin will not be in overdraft so that you can at least be neutral. You're not overdrafting groundwater. So we're kind of fortunate in that there's only 2 groundwater subbasins in the entire San Joaquin Valley that are not listed in critical overdraft, and that is the Modesto and Turlock subbasins. They're the only 2 not in critical overdraft. Mind you, they're the only 2 also that own their own reservoir and know how to manage water appropriately. So besides that, now you have Bay Delta Plan that says we're going to take all this surface water. Well, if you take all the surface water, they've talked about 250, 300,000 acres of farmland that would have to be fallowed to compensate for the loss of water. Farmers don't want to go out of business. So what are they going to do? They're going to look for another resource. So they're going to want to tap groundwater. But you have Sigma saying you can't overdraft your aquifer. So if you have no access to surface water and you have or limited access to surface water and limited access to groundwater, you are left with fallowing. And you're left with people going out of business, and you're left with unemployment. 1 in 3 jobs in Stanislaus County is dependent upon agriculture. And you're left with hits to community services, because if you don't have access to water, what happens to the value of your land? It plummets. And if the value of your land plummets because you don't have access to water, what happens to the value of property taxes? They plummet. And what do property taxes go toward? They go to the county to pay for police and fire and health and public services and first responders that we are all dependent on, and they all suffer. There will be less money for public safety. There's less money for our local schools. If groundwater plummets and drops, you're talking about hits to our rural schools who are on wells and they're dependent upon clean drinking water. So Sigma and Bay Delta are very closely interrelated in that this is a double whammy. And where our community is a shining star of how to properly manage groundwater. When in the early 90s, the Modesto Irrigation District started delivering drinking water to the city of Modesto, built a water treatment plant, and started delivering enough to meet about 50% of the demand of the city of Modesto. Why? Because the city of Modesto was the largest groundwater user in the water basin. You got a city of 200,000 people that's 100% on groundwater. It's a lot of water going out of your groundwater basin every year. After Modesto Irrigation District started delivering surface water to the city of Modesto to offset their pumping, the water table under Modesto rose 42 feet in the next 20 years. That is sustainable groundwater management. But when you talk about now Bay Delta plan and taking the water, the contract with City Modesto says whatever percentage farmers are cut from their allocation, the city is cut by the same percentage. They're not given a contract. They don't have a contracted amount of water every year. They're given an acreage, just like a farmer is. And when a farmer gets an allotment per acre, the city of Modesto has an acreage, and they get an allotment per acre. So if that allotment is reduced, it means less water for city of Modesto, which means they have to go back onto wells and overdraft groundwater again.
So do you lose quality of water then, basically?
Absolutely. That was the whole reason City of Modesto and MID wanted to come to an agreement, was because they were having high levels of uranium and arsenic and other terrible things in the water, and they were having to actually shut off wells because the quality was so bad or going dry. They needed another source. Once you bring in that other source, you use it to dilute the water with some of your cleaner wells. And then as the water table rises in that aquifer again under City of Modesto, it actually improves water quality in the groundwater because the solution to pollution is dilution. So if you can dilute that groundwater a little bit, you better quality.
Right. Okay. Cool.
Do you think, Jake, that there's any potential for improved water management on farms?
You know, you hear that a lot. And people don't realize that in the last 40 years, agricultural water use in California has gone virtually unchanged, yet we produce 40% more than we did before. That's pretty significant when you think of conservation. We're using roughly the same amount of water. We're producing significantly more food with it. So the conservation measures have been implemented. There's not a lot more you can do. And a lot of people talk about, well, we need to be on drip or micro irrigation. A lot of people who say that also don't realize that drip and micro irrigation can use more water than flood. There's more than just putting the water on because there's other factors. What's the temperature outside? What's your soil type? What's the commodity type? Because all of those are going to influence water uptake into the plant. So to just say we need everybody to switch to drip irrigation is irresponsible water management. Additionally, it doesn't put anything back in the aquifer. And flood irrigation is not a four-letter word in California, or should not be, because when you're on sandy, I have an orchard that I can irrigate. It takes me 3 hours and 15 minutes to irrigate a check. I can irrigate a check from midnight to 3:15 in the morning and switch to a next one. By the time it's about 8 o'clock in the morning, I can pretty much walk across that first check without getting my feet wet. There was no evaporation between midnight and 3:15 in the morning. That water went somewhere, went down. So there are some sandy soils that do allow for good water penetration, which is good for the aquifers. You can actually improve the aquifers. In fact, I was at a water meeting last year in November, an organization called California Foundation for the Environment and the Economy, and environmental group Sustainable Conservation gave an hour-long presentation on why we should be encouraging flood irrigation in the state of California again. Because
I know that that was one of the things that MID was encouraging growers that on the west side of the county, or on the west side of Modesto, was to go ahead and flood irrigate. Of course, people are asking the question, well, why are you flood irrigating? You're wasting water. But the point of recharging the aquifer is extremely valuable and important to the whole situation.
And additionally, you're flood irrigating with surface water and not groundwater. So even then, a lot of the talk of bringing back flood irrigation, say in the South Valley, is if we can get them surface water and off of wells, even if you're not on soil that's going to allow for recharge, it's not sandy soil, the water is not going to penetrate back down. Well, if you can still get surface water to them, and even if they flood irrigate, they didn't run their pumps that year. And if they didn't run their pumps that year, they call that in lieu of recharge. You're recharging the aquifer because you didn't pump it. If I take $1,000 out of your bank account every month, and 1 month I don't, you didn't make an additional $1,000 that month, but you had an extra $1,000 at the end of it. So you're not necessarily putting it back in, but you're gaining it by not spending it.
Right. Is that occurring on the east side of Modesto, where they're pumping water and flooding as opposed to running surface water? There
is some of that. There's a lot on the east side. If you're outside the irrigation district, you get a lot of pumping. So when you get in the foothills, east part of the county, that's mostly all on groundwater. There have been some efforts by Modesto Irrigation District, Oakdale Irrigation District, and others to try and, in high water years, get water to those people outside the district to get them off of groundwater for a year. And there has been some success there, but there needs to be a lot more development. A lot of it is, if you're a grower, if the irrigation district says, hey, look, if I've got access to water, if we have a high water year, instead of sending 4 million acre feet out to the ocean, if I can get you some of it, because our reservoir's already full. Once your reservoir's full, the water just goes out. We had it a couple years ago. Reservoir was full. We just watched water go down the river the whole time because we couldn't put it anywhere. Well, if we could have gotten that to some of those east side growers and got them off of groundwater for a year, it would have been beneficial to that aquifer. The challenge is it takes a lot of infrastructure, a lot of cost at the grower's expense. How much initiative is there for the grower to go through a massive expense of putting in a lot of infrastructure when they don't have a guaranteed source of getting that water every year? It just, from a business standpoint, it doesn't necessarily compute.
Yeah, that's very, very accurate, very true. Aaron, is there anything else you'd like to ask?
I think I'm pretty good.
Matthew, you've been sitting here just contemplating the whole discussion. Was anything piquing your interest?
No, I think you pretty well explained it all. I didn't really have quite as much of knowledge of it all. I think that really solidified it all for me. So thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm happy to be here. I'm sorry I talk too much. It's a problem I have.
No, this is great.
Aaron, you said everything that we needed to hear. And it's not just us, but it's the listeners to this podcast. Mm-hmm. And it's even important to the listeners in the north part of the state that have not been faced with this predicament that we're faced with. It's kind of interesting that the folks in the northern part of the state not being impacted by this kind of a thing don't have the same concept of what we're facing. And your explanation of what we're faced with is really excellent. And I really appreciate your dialogue, Jake. It's been great. And as Mark Twain said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting.
That's great. Yeah, thanks again, Jake.
Well, thank you guys for having me, and I wish water wasn't for fighting, but it is vital and important to our regions and our communities and the people it puts to work and the clean drinking water that we have, and it is worth the fight. And so check out worthyourfight.org. Check out Worth Your Fight on Facebook. Find out how you can stay involved, stay informed, because this fight's not going anywhere. Thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about what's going on, and we can build up an army and keep the fight going.
And that we will.
Now's the time on our show for upcoming events for Stanislaus Concerned Citizens, State of Jefferson. Every night every first and third Wednesday at the Grizzly Rock Cafe in Turlock, beginning at 5:30 for our SOJ update and 6 p.m. for our guest speaker. Please RSVP if possible. September 19th, we're going to have Assemblyman Heath Flora speaking to us at 6 p.m. At 5:30, SOJ quiz and an update. September 21st, we're going to Sacramento to turn in our declaration to the Secretary of State. So please sign up, see Marie or Aaron for more information on that. And we need more people to drive, so if you can drive, that's great. And carpool, that would be wonderful. Thank you. Getting on to October 3rd, we're going to have more information coming for that meeting soon. The 17th of October, we're going to meet at the Modesto Police Department. We're going to learn about ID fraud. October 20th and 21st, we're going to have the gun show at the Stanislaus County Fairgrounds. That's the Code of the West gun show, lasting both Saturday and Sunday, the 20th and 21st. We're going to have a booth out there both days, so sign up, please, if you can. And in the meantime, watch out for Blitzing Fly It Friday and Sign It Saturday, and look for these events on Facebook, email, and the website. Also, two websites I want to bring your attention to are worthyourfight.org and Tuolumne River Management Plan.com. Both of them have Facebooks as well, so check them out and check out those websites. They're very, very important, especially the worthyourfight.org. Thank you.
Thanks so much again, Jake, for coming on. If you're interested in sponsoring our show, you can head over to jeffersonlibertyradio.com or email us at sponsors@jeffersonlibertyradio.com. We'd like to thank the company that we are recording in for the use of their space. I don't know that we can name them, so we'll just call them the Unknown Company, just like the Unknown Church up in Reading. We want to thank them for the use of their space for recording. Thank you for listening to our episode. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at feedback@jeffersonlibertyradio.com or via our website, again, at jeffersonlibertyradio.com. We would love to hear and welcome all your questions and comments. Don't forget to subscribe to us in iTunes. Leave us a 5-star review. We would really, really appreciate it. It does help our ratings a lot. You can find us on the normal social media, Facebook, Twitter, even stuff like Spotify, YouTube, and Google Play, and alternative media such as BitChute and Gab. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Jefferson Liberty Radio, and we will catch you next episode.